We didn't mean to kill Mrs. Westerfield. Mrs. Westerfield was an old woman. She couldn't hear properly and we often had to yell out our answers so she could understand us. She wasn't a bad teacher in terms of education. I actually learned a lot from her when I was focusing on my work. I guess it was her attitude that caught our attention. She called us toxic brats and repeatedly said we were our parents' mistakes. I don't mean saying it like, "Oh, you kids." I mean she was looking us in the eye and telling us our parents should have used protection. We thought she was joking around at first, but then Nate threw a paper airplane at her head and she completely snapped, twisting around and telling him he would amount to nothing right in his face. Imagine an 80-something-year-old looming over your desk with a glass eye screaming at you. Nate thought it was hilarious. We all did. It was so out of place. Sure, we were used to her scowling and grumbling under her breath. But she had never confronted one of us before. With such confidence, too. She had all these stories of working in the government before she became a teacher. I found it hard to believe that our ancient math teacher was a high-profile government agent, though she did tell some interesting stories. When we asked what exactly it was that she did, she got tight-lipped and refused to say. Apparently, she would be spilling government secrets. Mrs. Westerfield wore the exact same shirt with the exact same stain on her collar every day. Jack, who was usually the teacher's pet type of kid, innocently asked if she was wearing the same shirt, and she called him a little runt. Granted, Jack Tors did look kind of like a sewer rat, though this set us off into full-blown hysterics, and the madder she became, the funnier it was. And so, the teasing began. I can confidently say the main culprit was Nate himself. We weren't the type of class who are supposed to get along, and Nate was definitely the quiet type of kid who sat at the back and listened to his music. Mrs. Westerfield affected him though. She had an effect on all of us. I had never been a bully. None of us had. Sure, I had witnessed it in small doses, but I had never been one. Mrs. Westerfield changed that. I like to think she was a witch, that she was the one who made us act like that, which set off the events leading to her death. Because no matter who we were outside of 4th period math, we all came together with a mutual hate for our sociopathic math teacher. It wasn't really hate. I never hated Mrs. Westerfield. That's what I told the cops when we were accused of murder. Every school has its bad apples, right? Well, that was us, or at least what we were turned into. I'm not sure how to explain the effect she had on us, and it was even harder to tell the sheriff, who just nodded and smiled and wrote nothing down. How do you explain a realistic type of magic? The type I was sure had been cast over us, because none of us had a logical explanation as to why we acted like this except magic. It's like, one day we were normal 16-year-olds worrying about global politics, the state of the world, and if prom was going to be cancelled for the 2nd year in a row. But then we were this weird tactical squad turned found family, and we bonded through our pranks on our teacher. I didn't really have a family of my own. I mean, I did. Mom worked nights and spent most of her free time on Facebook, and Dad just didn't come home. When Nate jumped onto a desk one day suggesting gluing toilet paper to the ceiling with a slightly manic look in his eyes, you would think a group of 17-year-olds would roll their eyes and tell him to stop acting like a baby, except no, Nate had become our unofficial leader. If I talk about this effect like some kind of disease, maybe it will help me get the message across, because that is what it felt like. Do you know that giddy feeling you got as a kid? It was like that, but tenfold, like being high. I didn't think logically. I didn't judge anyone or laugh at their stupidity. It was exactly like being a carefree kid again, uncaring, and completely wild with no sense of right or wrong. Sometimes I would catch myself scribbling on her whiteboard, laughing with the others, and it would hit me in a rush of clarity. What the fuck was I doing? Before that fog would take over again, and I was lost to the clouds, and the idea that what we were doing was hilarious. There were moments when I started to question if something was in the air. Maybe it was the time Nate instigated a paint fight. Nate was not the type to act like this. He was radio silent in every class. He was smart and spoke like he'd been chewing on a thesaurus. Mrs. Westerfield's 4th period math, however, it was almost like he was in some manic trance, becoming this class clown. He looked funny. I mean, a fully grown guy jumping around on a desk like a kid, laughing hysterically while gluing scraps of toilet paper to the ceiling, must be alarming to some people, right? To us, this weird effect was spreading. I joined in with the others until we had successfully ruined the ceiling and almost given our teacher a coronary. I think it was the thrill of seeing her reactions. Initially, it was anger. She screamed at us, which made us laugh even more. But then it became annoyance, which gradually turned to psycho. So we kept doing it, this time with pen lids. We started off small, and as these pranks grew more frequent, we started hanging out together more. On Tuesday nights, we would gather at the diner and share milkshakes, brainstorming our next prank. There was nothing else to do in our small town except watch a movie or go to the park. Our base of operations was at the town diner, and when we were exposed by a snitch, we moved to the town lake. In summer, we dragged along picnic baskets in our swimsuits, and in the fall, we gathered around a campfire and told scary stories. It started off innocently. We weren't technically doing anything wrong. I was surprised that she didn't tell the principal after the toilet paper incident. It was Nate's idea to fake a zombie outbreak. We had fake blood from the theater kids, and the group of us were pretty good actors. What we weren't expecting, though, was for Mrs. Westerfield to collapse when 3 of us freshly zombified lunged at her with bared teeth and fake blood running down our chin, pretending to bite out of her throat. I didn't think we looked that realistic. We couldn't afford eye contacts, and the blood was too thick. But I didn't think of the consequences of scaring an old woman. Things got pretty real super fast. Mrs. Westerfield had suffered a heart attack and in the ambulance on the way to the emergency room had died. The problem was though, I didn't remember any of this. My brain completely blanked from my classroom to the sheriff's station. Immediately, we were brought in for questioning, and the spell was broken. It felt like something had been severed inside both my brain and my thoughts. A physical and then mental cut, like a bond being broken. I remember spending almost 8 hours inside the sheriff's station feeling like I had just woken up from a trance. When we were first taken in, the 12 of us thought it was funny, somehow. We were still laughing like kids, but it was when we were told that our teacher was dead. That was when everything kind of stopped, and my brain turned topsy-turvy, a sour paste creeping up my throat. I blinked, and the world around me was so much more gray. My zombie makeup looked childish and wrong in the mirror when I had to run to the bathroom to empty my guts. Catching my reflection was like waking up. I was Noah Samuels, 17 years old. That's who I was. It took a while for me to remember that, for my name to come rushing back, like for the last few months. I had been an extra in my own life, a character with no identity, no name, just a bully in a group of clowns. Swiping away dried barf, I started to realize something was very wrong. I wasn't supposed to feel this foggy-headed. Inside that room, none of us spoke. Nate tried to, but he was told to shut up. He started with, I don't mean to freak anyone out, but Jack snapped at him to shut the fuck up. He didn't speak again, though I was sure he was going to come out with exactly what I was feeling, what we were all feeling. From my place sitting on the floor cross-legged on cold concrete, I felt sick to my stomach. Reality was starting to hit, and it was hitting hard. But reality didn't feel real. The months leading to that exact moment felt fake, like I hadn't even lived them, like my body had been on automatic. We had killed Mrs. Westerfield. I caught the others' frightened looks, but how? Did we really kill her through a stupid prank? I thought about saying something, because every time I tried to go back to that memory, to me standing over her body giggling like a maniac, something felt wrong, like someone had reached into my brain and threaded their way through my thoughts. The group of us were let go eventually. Mrs. Westerfield's family had decided not to press charges and we were free to go, but walking out felt wrong. I still felt like a murderer, even if I hadn't technically done anything. Sure, it was a stupid fucking prank that went way too far, but when I really thought about it, we had bullied our teacher to death. In this endless trance that I barely remember being in, we had been ruthless, cruel bullies. It wasn't just the fake zombie outbreak. We made her life miserable. When I tried to think of what exactly we had done, however, I had either suppressed or forgotten completely. Things got quiet after her death. We stopped hanging out altogether. Some of our parents insisted we attend therapy, while others were grounded, or worse, beaten. It was never officially said, but when Casper Croft walked into class with a blooming bruise under his eye, it didn't take us long to figure out what was going on. We started to slowly unravel as a group. Olivia started muttering to herself in the middle of class, swatting at imaginary flies. Jack kept getting answers wrong. Initially, he just scuffed up certain sums and calculations. He answered palm tree to a basic math equation, and then rabbit when he was asked if he was okay. When he was questioned, Jack acted like he didn't say anything weird, insisting he said the answer. Nate went back to hiding behind his hood and corking his headphones in. However, I noticed him wiping his hands on the front of his shirt a lot. It started normally enough before he started doing it frequently, and it's not even like he noticed himself. Otis Mears, who sat near him, commented on it, and Nate just looked at him like he'd grown an additional limb. We didn't talk about any of it, not the strange blanks we couldn't explain or our classmates acting strange. I'm sure we wanted to, but it's not like the adults or our classmates would believe us. They just threw phrases like PTSD and trauma in our faces. Mrs. Westerfield was replaced by a man who probably survived the Spanish flu. This time there were no jokes or pranks. We stayed silent and had to be forced to speak. The spell had been broken, and we were left confused and guilty of an indirect murder without consequences. I guess we had made an unspoken pact not to say anything and ride it out until graduation. Our new teacher was called Mr. Hart. He was cold and snappy, complaining that we weren't lively enough. One day, he said we would be doing a specialized test on the weekend. I thought that others would protest, but they just nodded, dazedly, like this could finally be some kind of punishment. I remember my mom's look of confusion over breakfast. I don't think I've ever heard of a test on a weekend, she said through a mouthful of orange juice. Ironically, after indirectly murdering my teacher, I kind of got my mom back. She started working less and paying more attention to what I was doing. Maybe mom thought I was planning on becoming some mass teacher-killing psychopath. She drove me to school and spent the whole car ride reminding me college wasn't far away and juvie would ruin my life. I sarcastically let her know that Mrs. Westerfield was my last victim. So, are you ever going to tell me about what happened? She pushed. Ever since our teacher's death, Mom had been trying to understand, but I didn't have an explanation except I'm pretty sure I was under a spell. Like drugs, Mom twisted to me so fast I thought she was going to crash the car. No, I said, I mean actual magic. I looked up from mindlessly skimming through barely loaded Vine videos. The 4G signal sucked where we lived. Magic? Mom turned back to the wheel with a scoff. Sweetie, that is disrespectful to the deceased. You can't just say your teacher was a witch. Something cold crept down my spine, and for the first time in a while, my blood boiled. I knew she wouldn't understand. That's why I didn't dare tell her the truth. I had been having nightmares about that exact day, but each nightmare was a different scenario. In some of them, I was holding a knife, grinning down at my teacher's corpse, while others, I watched my cohort scoop her insides from her body with their bare hands, bathing themselves in glistening gore. Looking down at my hands, they were slick scarlet. Fuck. Blinking rapidly, I swiped them on my jeans. Maybe I did need therapy after all. I shook my head of the dream that continued to creep on me. You're supposed to forget your nightmares, but this one wouldn't leave me alone. It felt almost as real as reality, and I'd found myself pinching myself on multiple occasions. Well, how do you expect me to explain it? I snapped. How am I supposed to explain not being in full control of myself, Mom? Her gaze didn't leave the road. Can you expand on the not being in control of yourself? I don't know, I admitted. I had a brain blank. The next thing I knew, I was being hauled into the sheriff's office, and my math teacher was dead. Don't say it like that. What else do you want me to say? She was dead, Mom. I came to at the sheriff's station, and they told me she was dead. I caught the rhythmic beat of her fingers on the steering wheel. Mom was pissed. So, you were taking drugs. Her voice grew shrill. You blanked out the ordeal completely. No, that's what I'm trying to tell you, I gritted out. You know Nate, right? The mayor's son. I straightened up. Yes, Nate wasn't acting like his usual self. He was acting like a kid, Mom. I keep telling you it's like we were under a spell. Nate doesn't do shit like that. His father is the mayor. Why would he act like that? I don't know, he reads boring books with shitty titles and looks down on the rest of us for breathing. He said like 3 words since freshman year, and I think she did something to him. I didn't realize I was shouting until Mom held up her hand for me to lower my voice. Can't you see what I'm saying? He started paint fights. He stuck toilet paper to the classroom ceiling and glued a card on his face just to get a reaction out of her. That wasn't him. Mom stopped at a red light. You think your dead teacher cast a spell on your classmate to make him bully her? Yes. I caught her words and then her darkening expression. Outside, I glimpsed Haley Derry walking to school, kicking through fall leaves. She was nodding her head to music corked in her ears, her ponytail bouncing up and down. Wait, no, you're twisting my words. Huh, I slumped in my seat. You don't believe me, so what's the point? I believe that you have an imagination. Mom rolled her eyes. Seriously, though, I can understand that you thought you were having fun, but that poor woman was probably suffering. She sighed. I wish you were mature enough to realize that what you were doing was wrong. I bit back a groan. What would you say if I told you I could barely remember the last few months? I would send you to a doctor, sweetie. Okay, I nodded. Well, I doubt a doctor would be able to tell me I was under some crazy magic spell. Mom sent me a sharp look. Noah, you are being ridiculous. If you were in fact taking drugs, you can tell me. I won't be mad. She caught herself. Okay, I will be mad, but at least I will have an explanation as to why my son has gone completely off the rails and killed a teacher. She did that thing she always did when her lip wobbled, and I was expected to feel guilty. Do you even realize what you have put me through? Mom exhaled. I had a feeling weeks of pent-up frustration and fake smiles had led up to this. Mom wouldn't even look me in the eye when she bailed me out. I had to take time off and explain to my boss that my 17-year-old son has harassed his math teacher to a heart attack. Do you even understand what you have done? She was crying then, and I found myself attempting to console her before she shoved me away. You should know right from wrong by now. She tightened her grip on the wheel. You've forgotten your contact lenses, Mom said. You know you get migraines when you don't wear them. I'm fine. That was a lie. I couldn't see shit without my contacts or glasses. I dropped my phone in my lap, my gaze flitting to fall leaves strewn across the sidewalk outside. You asked me to explain what happened to me, and that's it. I don't remember half of the shit I did, and when I try to recall it, it's like picking through a fucking dream. I don't know why I stuck toilet paper everywhere. I don't know why I poured aquarium water into her bag or pretended to be a zombie. It's fucked. Language. Freaking. I grumbled, correcting myself. We were nearing the school gates, so I started to get a little too brave. Anyway, you didn't even care what I was doing until a few weeks ago. It took me accidentally murdering my teacher with my class for you to give a fuck about me and look up from Candy Crush. Noah, I crumpled in my seat. Sorry, Farmville. Noah, look at me. I did, turning to my frazzled-looking mother whose eyes were shadowed with sleep circles. You keep talking about how it affected you, she said. You haven't once mentioned your teacher's family or Mrs. Westerfield's feelings. You didn't even ask to offer your grievances. I'm sure that would go well. It's not that you didn't go, Noah. It's that you never offered. That the thought never crossed your mind. Mom didn't sound angry, she sounded upset. I hated when she got upset because my facade started to crumble too. I wanted her to understand that I thought I was going crazy and that I wasn't a bad person. I had been trying to convince myself of a lot of things, that I wasn't crazy or that I had no ill intent towards my teacher, except I didn't know. This version of me that had been living my life, casually bullying Mrs. Westerfield, was like a shadow, a shell with my face. I was starting to spiral. I found myself rubbing my hands on my jeans, my stomach twisting, chest tightening. I had to get it off, was all I could think. I had to get it off. I felt filthy and wrong, and every time I dared glance down my hands, they felt wet and warm. Before Mom could give me a grand speech on getting help, I climbed out of the car and slammed the door shut before she could wind the window down. I saw her attempt to try and say something, but Mom just turned back to the wheel, her expression crumbling. She drove away before I could tell her I was fucking terrified of my own mind, and what I had really done to my teacher, because the terrifying reality was that we didn't know. All we knew was that she was dead, and the family didn't want to disclose any details. When I arrived at the school's gate, a security guard let me in. Odd. I don't think I had ever seen security, but it was a weekend, so I figured I was just ignorant in a sea full of kids who thought the world revolved around them. When I was walking through the automatic doors though, I glimpsed a large truck reversing into the parking lot. It looked like the school was getting work done. I signed in at the main reception and was directed to the main auditorium. The school was eerie on a weekend. It was darker somehow, light fixtures flickering over my head as I headed to my locker to dump my backpack and phone. The instructions were to leave all of our stuff in our usual locker and then head to the auditorium. I was heading towards the staircase when a classroom door rattled once before going still. In the eerie silence of the hallway, slivers crept their way down my spine. I had a moment of, fuck, is there someone in there? And then remembered the janitor most likely did a deep clean of the campus on weekends. Still, though, I found my gaze flicking to my hands expecting to see bright red. Nope. They were just my hands. So, why did I still feel filthy? Why did I feel like something was caked into my fingernails? Before I could spiral into that territory, I made myself scarce, navigating my way to the auditorium with a twist in my gut. I couldn't stop thinking about that classroom door, the way it had rattled once, as if someone had slammed their fists into it once, and then what? The hall was already filling up with my class when I entered and slumped into my seat right at the back. Nate was missing from his usual place near me. I hadn't seen the dude in a few days. There was a flu going around, though Nate wasn't one to miss classes. Olivia Reyes was sitting in front of me. When I walked in, I saw her scratching at her arms and then bending down to claw at her legs. The skin of her arm was flushed red when she raised her hand, lips curled into a scowl. "Why are the blinds closed?" she demanded, tapping her feet against her chair leg. I had been wondering that too, because something was definitely going on outside. Mr. Hart was standing at the front, sorting through papers with a pair of white rubber gloves. Our teacher had been a germ freak, so it wasn't out of the ordinary for him to be wearing gloves. His wrinkled eyes were shaded with a pair of expensive-looking glasses with colored lenses. Mr. Hart never wore glasses. When he lifted his head, his lip quirked into a rare smile. "Do you want to be distracted, Olivia?" She shrugged. "I want to see the outside." The girl scratched at her arm again. "I'm not getting any vitamin D sitting in a dark room. I'm actually vitamin D deficient." The teacher nodded. "Well, you can get a note from your mother and I'll move you to a room with sunlight streaming through the windows for the next test. But can we go to the bathroom?" Jack spoke up from the front. He had already offered to hand out the test papers, only to be immediately shut down. Because I heard last year, some kid from Australia held it in for the whole class and his bladder exploded. Like, literally, he had to be airlifted to the emergency room. Yes, Mr. Hart began handing out papers, and a dull pain split down the back of my skull. Migraine. I could feel it brewing, glimmers of light bleeding across my vision. My teacher's voice felt like a knife digging into my head. Something prickled on my arm, a stray bug skittering across my skin. I brushed it off, swallowing a cry. Bugs? Was there some kind of infestation? "If you need the bathroom, you can go." I didn't realize I had dropped my head onto the cool wood of my desk until a voice brought me back to fruition, my thoughts swimming. "You may begin," Mr. Hart announced, except I couldn't concentrate. I was covered in bugs, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. I could feel them. I could feel their phantom skittering legs running up and down my legs and arms, creeping across my face and filling my mouth. Fuck. The pain in my head was worsening, no longer a dull thud that I could ignore. The test began. At least I think it did. The room went silent. I was trying to blink away the sharp lights blooming into my vision. My migraines weren't usually this bad. "Noah, are you sick?" I looked up, blinking rapidly. There was a shadow looming over me. Mr. Hart holding my test paper. "Not really," I managed to get out. "I have a migraine." "That is not an excuse," my teacher slapped down the paper. "If you do not complete the test, you will be suspended." The man's words didn't feel real, his voice white noise. There was just a pain in the back of my eyes and splitting my skull open. I blinked again, and the shadow with Mr. Hart's voice blurred into one confusing mix of color. "I can't see," I said. "I can't read the test, so what do you expect me to do?" "To avoid being suspended, I expect you to smile and bear it." I nodded and tried to smile, snatching the test paper off of the man. "Fine." When he walked away, I bowed my head to appear like I was writing, when in reality I had my eyes squeezed shut in an attempt to chase away the light show going off in the backs of my eyelids. I don't think I fell asleep, though it felt like I did. I was back inside my math classroom in my zombie makeup, laughing hysterically over the body of Mrs. Westerfield. when something screamed. No, not a voice. It was a sound. The world spun around and round as I dropped to my knees, my hands pressed over my ears, the pressure slamming into my head. Peeling back my hands, my palms were wet and sticky, bright scarlet trickling down my fingers. I was screaming into the floor when it stopped. A voice sounded, but I didn't recognize it. The doors flew open, figures streaming through, and I was being dragged to my feet. Jack was standing in front of me, his lips stretched into a wide grin. Nate, Olivia, Otis, all of them laughing, their faces, hands, and fingers stained red. The figures around us did not have faces. I could feel their hands grabbing hold of my arms and pinning them behind my back. This time we were covered in Mrs. Westerfield. The sound of a pencil hitting the floor snapped me out of it, bringing me back to the present, sitting in the auditorium, my stomach trying to puke into my throat. I could still hear that sound, faded but still there, slowly bleeding its way into my brain. Not real, I told myself. It wasn't real, but I couldn't be sure. Whatever this was, it was either psychosis or memories that I had either made up myself or suppressed. I had my head buried in my arms, drool pooling down my chin. I'm not sure how much time passed before I lifted my head, the pressure at the back of my skull relieving slightly. There were still lights, but I could finally see. In front of me was my paper. After a quick look around, the others were deeply embedded in their tests, so I grabbed my pen. Before I could write my name, however, I caught movement through the door at the front of the auditorium. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, maybe stray shadows in my eyes from my migraine. And yet when I squinted, leaning forward, I could definitely see something. Nate, I could glimpse the bright yellow of his jacket. Nate was acting strange, swaying from side to side, like he was drunk. When his head slammed into the door and I glimpsed the explosion of red on the glass, I thought back to the rattling classroom door. By now, the rest of the class had noticed Nate. Mr. Hart, Olivia's voice broke around the ladder of his name. She didn't seem to notice our disgruntled classmate. I can't read the last question. Look at the question, Olivia. I am, but it's all squiggly. Bang. Nate slammed his head into the door again, this time stumbling his way through. He didn't look like Nate. He looked almost rabid, a bloody surgical mask over his mouth. In front of me, Olivia screamed, and Jack leapt up with a yell. The rest of the class were frozen, their gazes glued to the boy. We were all seeing this, right? I think that was the question hanging in the air. Nate, the class joker and our former leader, was covered in blood, his jacket sleeve stained revealing scarlet. His crown of dark blonde curls was bowed, only for his head to finally snap up. This time, I was the one who cried out. But my shriek had caught in my throat. Nate's entire face was drooped to one side, eyes half-lidded and vacant. When he pulled back his mask, his teeth gritted together in a vicious, animalistic snarl. I could see the bite on his arm, teeth marks denting his flesh. The world around me seemed to stop when Nate stumbled forward, swaying side to side, a feeble groan escaping his lips. Somehow, I was seeing a real-life zombie in front of me, and my mind was replaying my teacher's death like a stuck record. I could feel myself slowly skirting back on my chair, my gaze snapping to Mr. Hart, who wasn't paying attention. Instead, he was sitting silently, shaded eyes on a pile of papers he was signing. Jack was the first one to speak in a shrill yell when Nate crashed through an empty desk. Mr. Hart. Jack slammed his hands over his ears. What's going on? The teacher ignored us, ignored the violent crash of desks flying forward. It took me half a minute to remember how to move, jumping to my feet and staggering back. Nate's expression was blank, lips contorted like he was trying to move them. I didn't know how to use a weapon. Until 5 minutes ago, zombies were fictional. I wasn't moving fast enough. Nate's head moved to the side, empty eyes slowly drinking me in. He was lunging at me before I knew what was happening. His speed didn't make sense, fingernails gripping hold of my collar and forcing me backward. In the corner of my eye, Jack made for the door. He yanked at it, letting out a frustrated yell. It's locked. I was half aware of Olivia trying to grasp hold of the feral boy, but she was too scared to touch him. His weight crashed into me, and I found myself suffocated under strength he shouldn't have had. When Nate's gnashing teeth went for my throat, I forgot how to breathe. But he wasn't biting me, instead gnawing on my shirt collar. His hands clawing at my arm were trembling, breaths tickling my face. He was frightened, struggling for breath. I should have noticed it, but my mind was screaming zombies. There was something dripping down his forehead, beads of red pooling down his face. Now that he was closer, I could see bandages wrapped around his head, where something had been forced into the back of his skull. He was covered in blood. His jacket, however, was soaked in something else. It had a distinct smell. Tomato sauce. Nate's lips grazed my ear, and I dropped to the ground when he told me to. I cried out audibly when he jerked his head to the camera mounted on the ceiling. "We're fucked." His voice came out in a slurred giggle. Nate's breaths were labored, his body jolting like he'd suffered an electric shock, bright red dripping from his nose and ears. But not from the bite, I thought dizzily, because the zombie bite on his arm wasn't real. The intrusion in the back of his skull, however, which had been clumsily wrapped with bandages, was real, causing slurred speech. Nate was not zombified. He was dying. "They are fucking watching us," Nate whispered into my neck. I could feel his jaw clenching, teeth working like he was ripping out my throat. "Play along." Before I could reply, he slowly got to his feet, swaying off balance. I blinked and I was back inside my math classroom, lying on a desk. I couldn't move. This time Mrs. Westerfield was the one looming over me, lips curled into a small smile, her gloved hands dripping like she had soaked them in paint. Drop. Nate's croak snapped me back to reality, and all around me, my classmates were falling like dominoes. Olivia fell to her knees and slumped onto her stomach, and Jack fell backward, crashing into a desk. Nate straightened up like his puppet strings were being pulled, slowly inclining his head. "Play along," he told me, so I did, slowly lowering myself to the floor, pressing my face into the arms to suffocate my sharp gasps for breath. I found myself stewing in silence before the intercom crackled overhead. "You worked for the government." Nate's voice was a choked laugh. I remembered that exact day. He was sent out of the classroom for calling her a liar. His voice was being projected across the auditorium, like we had been the joke the whole time. I risked looking up. The present Nate wasn't reacting to his own voice. His eyes were half-lidded, head lolling to the side. Looking to my left, Jack was completely out of it. Wait, no. I caught movement, his fingers curling slightly. No, he was still awake, but he couldn't move. Do you kids know the science behind bullying? I should have been surprised by my dead teacher's voice coming through the intercom in her usual nasal screech, though my suppressed memories had always known she was alive. "I have missed teaching you," she continued with a sigh. "Today, I would actually like to talk to you about my job working with what we call chemical agents." This was back in the 80s, and back then, we didn't really care what we did to people, as long as we got results. She paused, clearing her throat. I was in charge of testing beta agents on bad people. My job was researching how the human mind ticks, why we think as we do, and if it's possible to influence our own thoughts. Think of them like viruses. They're contagious, though it depends on how exactly they spread. I didn't realize I was crawling across the floor, trying to reach Jack, before Nate's shoe stamped on my head, pinning me down. We had agents that spread through bodily fluids like Ebola and the Marburg virus, agents that spread through water droplets like the common cold or flu, and then we had ones that were far more unique, ones that we were saving for. Let's call it a rainy day. These ones could be spread through, well, anything, which made them deadly. Mrs. Westerfield paused for effect. These agents were used for more nefarious reasons, and if you don't mind, I don't feel comfortable describing what exactly we did to a group of children. However, I will tell you what they are. First, we have N7. I like to think of it as engineered anthrax. Anthrax, however, is a bacterial disease. N7 is different. If administered in small quantities over a certain amount of time, N7 is completely undetectable and only recognized by the patient him, her, themselves. N7 works exactly like a virus, but instead of causing destruction to the respiratory or digestive system, it latches itself to the central nerves and brain. Mrs. Westerfield's voice was strangely comforting, almost like a mother. "N7 is cruel," she said. "There is no cure." Developed by an interesting, and might I say, psychotic mind in our own ranks, the purpose of N7 is to strip away the human of their humanity for interrogation. But, darlings, times have changed, of course. The door opened, the sound ringing in my ears. Dragging footsteps coming toward me. The virus will take control of your ability to process simple things such as reading or problem solving. N7 will tear into your neural pathways and begin to eat away at your memories, either removing them completely or replacing them with disturbing images that will make you question your sanity. You will lose basic human abilities such as speech, the ability to hear and process words and phrases, your memories, your sight. You will become a living veggie that is only capable of basic survival instinct, as well as indescribable fear which will consume you completely before you reset. I screamed when Nate stamped on my head, forcing my face into the floor. His voice felt like a live wire in my ear. "Stay down," he ordered. His expression twisted, like the words themselves caused him agony. I did, my body instantly reacting to his order. "Activation," our teacher continued, ignoring me. From the speaker, the center of the hive mind, I could tell the woman was thrilled by her own words. "I haven't even told you about that yet. But you will, do not worry, kids. Essentially, the virus will reboot your mind completely. N7 is very different from our other agents due to its unique, and I would say cruel, mode of transmission and then activation," our teacher chuckled. "This part is very interesting and applies to you, so listen well. In the 80 seconds we had a certain protocol we could not break. The speaker, Mrs. Westerfield said, is our answer to that. It works like a king or queen, like an ant leading its army under the influence of Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. N7 is the closest we have come to creating a human hive mind." She paused. "Nate is my first speaker who survived the process. We used speakers as soldiers before disposing of them when they were no longer needed. But I made Nate myself. I think you will like him. He's a lot better like this." After administering several strains of N7, "He is the perfect guinea pig," she hummed. "Nate, sweetheart, why don't you demonstrate what a speaker is? I'm sure you have been excited to show them your skills." I could breathe again when the boy lifted his boot from my face. Choke. His words were like writhing insects creeping into my ears. I felt my chest tighten, all of the breath sucked from my lungs. I was choking. "Now, of course, you are not actually choking," Mrs. Westerfield said, "but if a voice powerful enough with the new N7 strain takes over your brain, especially an infected brain connected to the hive mind, then your body will believe anything and everything the speaker says." The bitch paused for effect again, like she was doing a fucking TED Talk. "Now, if you would excuse me, I will be preparing for stage 2 of this project. Stage 1 was research into why exactly we bully. What is the science behind it? Can we influence a mind to be cruel without a reason? The second is, of course, the effects of N7 on younger subjects. I would like to see how a group of 17-year-olds react when full activation is complete. And if they survive. Noah is a wild card right now. He did not touch his test paper nor look at it, which means right now, he is yet to be activated." She was talking to someone else, I realized. "Sleep." Mrs. Westerfield was right. Nate's voice slammed into me like waves of ice water, drowning my thoughts in fog. This time, it was an order, and my mind started to fade, my eyes growing heavy. It wasn't real. I wasn't really tired, but the voice in my head had already tightened its grasp, suffocating me. "Noah, sweetie." Mom's voice came through the intercom in a crackled hiss, and I felt myself jolt, my body writhing under Nate's control. She wasn't real. "You need to learn your lesson." Mom's voice sounded real, and yet I was alone, curled up on the floor of our school auditorium, choking on phantom bugs filling my mouth. Nate's words contorted my thoughts, twisting me into his puppet. "Just do exactly what your teacher tells you, and this will be over soon, baby." I did know one thing for sure. We were very fucking wrong about our teacher. Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.